Picture a scene for a second. A 68-year-old man is found on his kitchen floor by his daughter.
Oh, man.
Yeah, his right arm is completely motionless. And when he tries to speak to her, the words are coming out all wrong, just completely scrambled.
Right.
That is the entire call the ambulance dispatcher receives. I mean, we don't have his name. We don't have his medical history yet. It is just this raw, terrifying moment of a human body suddenly betraying itself.
It really is.
And while that ambulance is screaming down the street toward his house, that exact same scenario is quietly playing out in thousands of other kitchens, offices, and living rooms around the world today.
It is a profoundly chilling scenario, and to truly understand this single individual crisis, that one man lying on his floor, we first have to map the massive global landscape of ischemic stroke that his story is embedded in.
Right, because he's not an isolated case.
Exactly. He is not an anomaly at all. He is a very specific data point in a vast global current.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sheer scale of the data we are looking at for this deep dive is genuinely staggering.
It really is.
If we just look at the United States in isolation, we are seeing around 795,000 new or recurrent strokes every single year.
Yeah.
That is a population the size of a major city experiencing a catastrophic neurological event annually.
Now, we need to look closely at the composition of that number because it tells us a lot about the mechanics of this disease.
Okay.
Out of that 795,000, roughly 610,000 are first-time events. The remaining 185,000 are recurrences.
Wow, so almost 200,000 people are having a second or third stroke.
Precisely. That recurrence rate alone tells us that surviving a stroke doesn't mean you've crossed the finish line. Your system remains highly vulnerable. And the vast majority of these events, about 88%, are ischemic strokes.
Meaning a blockage, right?
Exactly.
Like a clot has either formed directly in a cerebral vessel or traveled from somewhere else in the body, creating a physical dam that cuts off the oxygen-rich blood supply to a targeted region of the brain.
That's perfectly stated. And within that ischemic category, the lethality is severe. The clinical data shows that 8 to 12% of those ischemic events prove fatal within the first 30 days.
Jeez.
It is a massive shock to the systemic function of the body.
Which is a really heavy baseline to establish for you listening. But what really jumped out at me in the epidemiological data is how our perception of where these strokes are happening might be completely disconnected from reality.
Oh, absolutely.
Globally, stroke remains a top-tier cause of death and disability, but the geographical epicenter has shifted aggressively. Mortality rates are exceptionally high in Eastern Europe and Asia now.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the demographic projections from 2020 revealed a fundamental shift in the global burden of disease.
A shift away from the West.
Exactly. The overwhelming majority of the world's annual stroke deaths were expected to occur in developing countries. But here is the critical vulnerability in our modern medical framework.
Okay, what is it?
Well, historically, the lion's share of our stroke research, our longitudinal clinical trials, and our deep understanding of the disease's mechanisms have been funded by and conducted in wealthier, industrialized nations.
Oh, I see. So we are essentially trying to route resources and design global public health campaigns using a GPS that hasn't updated its traffic data in a decade.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, we're looking for the massive pileup on a highway that we studied 30 years ago, completely blind to the fact that the actual epicenter of the catastrophe has moved to an entirely different continent.
I would take that analogy even further, actually. It is not just that we're looking at the wrong highway. We might be misunderstanding the local terrain altogether.
Really? How so?
Well, when you base your entire foundational understanding of a disease on one set of populations and demographics, and then the burden shifts to populations with completely different genetic backgrounds, diets, environmental stressors, and healthcare infrastructures, your predictive models begin to fail.
Ah, because the underlying variables changed.
Right. The global map has changed, and our medical framework has to sprint to catch up.
And while those mortality figures in developing nations are grim, we have to look at the flip side of that coin. Because if the 30-day mortality rate is roughly 10%, that leaves an enormous population of survivors.
A massive population.
And the data makes it painfully clear that surviving that initial 30-day window is, well, it's often just the opening chapter of a much longer, incredibly difficult reality.
It is a profound reality check for how we define survival in neurology.
Yeah.
When a patient's brain is starved of oxygen during an ischemic stroke, the resulting necrosis, which is the death of brain tissue, leaves a permanent functional deficit.
Because the brain tissue doesn't just grow back.
Exactly. Roughly 30% of survivors require permanent assistance with basic daily activities.
30%? Wow.
Think about the gravity of that for a moment for you or someone you love, suddenly relying on a spouse or a child to eat, to dress, to bathe. Another 20% require assistance just to walk.
That's heartbreaking.
And 16% end up requiring institutional care.
It fundamentally rewrites not just the patient's life, but the trajectory of their entire family. I mean,
Yeah.
we were talking about a massive, cascading societal and economic ripple effect.
Absolutely.
And if the aftermath is that devastating, the immediate question becomes, who is statistically standing in the path of this? Which brings us to the non-modifiable risk factors, the biological traits we are simply born with or acquire through time.
Right.
And the absolute heavyweight in that category is age.
It is the single most powerful driver of risk, bar none. Once a person hits the age of 55, their incidence of stroke essentially doubles every single decade.
Wait, it doubles every 10 years.
Every 10 years past 55. To put that in perspective, by the time we look at the macro-level data, half of all strokes are occurring in people over the age of 75.
I want to pause on that because it's easy to just say, older people get sick.
Yeah.
But what is the actual mechanism there? Why does the risk literally double every 10 years?
It comes down to the cumulative mechanical degradation of the vascular system over time. As we age, our blood vessels lose their elasticity.
Right.
The endothelial lining, which is the delicate inner wall of your arteries, accumulates micro tears and stiffens. Your body's cellular repair mechanisms slow down.
So it's basically wear and tear on the plumbing.
Exactly. So a minor plaque buildup that your body might have easily managed at 35 becomes a highly unstable, rigid blockade at 75.
And it isn't just a matter of how many miles are on the odometer. Sex and ethnicity play huge, deeply complex roles here, too.
They do.
For instance, men actually have higher rates of stroke between the ages of 45 and 75. But then the demographic data completely flips.
Yes, it does.
Women overtake men in incidences later in life, and ultimately women end up carrying a significantly higher lifetime risk of stroke overall.
And that flip is driven heavily by hormones. Prior to menopause, estrogen provides an incredible protective effect on the cardiovascular system. It helps keep blood vessels flexible and manages cholesterol levels. But once estrogen levels drop post-menopause, that biological shield is removed, and women's vascular risk accelerates rapidly, catching up to and eventually surpassing men's.
And when we examine ethnicity in the clinical data, the disparities become even more glaring. Black Americans carry roughly double the risk of a first stroke compared to white Americans.
Yes, the gap is very significant.
The research notes this is partly explained by higher underlying rates of diabetes and hypertension in that population, but the sheer gulf in risk is massive. Additionally, Native Americans show a particularly high incidence of stroke, specifically ischemic stroke.
The disparity is profound. And while we can point to comorbidities like diabetes, we also have to acknowledge the systemic stressors, environmental factors, and healthcare access gaps.
Right, the bigger societal picture.
Exactly. Those gaps allow those comorbidities to remain uncontrolled for decades in certain populations, ultimately culminating in these severe neurological events.
So what does this all mean? If you are sitting there listening to this deep dive, realizing that your age, your biological sex, your genetics, your ethnicity, all these things are hard-coded into your DNA, it can feel incredibly fatalistic.
It can.
Like you are just a passenger in a vehicle heading toward a cliff, waiting for a bad roll of the genetic dice.
I completely understand why looking at demographic data feels paralyzing, but I always tell patients to radically reframe how they view this information.
How so?
Understanding non-modifiable risks isn't about despair. It is the ultimate tool for targeted vigilance. It is not a crystal ball of doom.
Right.
If you know you fall into a demographic where your baseline risk is naturally elevated, you aren't helpless. You simply know exactly how aggressively you need to manage the factors you can control.
Which transitions us perfectly into the battleground.
Right.
We know who is historically in the crosshairs. Now let's look at the actual levers we can pull to fight back the modifiable risk factors.
Yes.
And leading the charge, the undisputed architect of vascular destruction hypertension.
It simply cannot be overstated in modern medicine. Hypertension is the single most important modifiable risk factor we have. It raises the relative risk of stroke 3 to 4-fold.
3 to 4 times the risk. That's wild.
And the reason why is entirely mechanical. Chronic high blood pressure accelerates atherosclerosis, which is the hardening and narrowing of your arteries.
Like we were talking about earlier with the aging plumbing.
Exactly. Imagine a delicate biological pipe. If you blast fluid through that pipe at an excessively high pressure, day after day, year after year, the sheer mechanical force shears and damages the inner lining.
It creates these micro abrasions along the vessel wall, right? Making it incredibly easy for circulating lipids and inflammatory cells to catch, build up into a plaque, and eventually rupture, causing the exact clot we've been talking about.
Precisely.
And then you bring diabetes into the mix, and things get exponentially worse. Diabetes raises the risk of stroke 2 to 4-fold, completely independently of age or blood pressure.
Yes, on its own, it's a huge risk.
But when you pair diabetes with hypertension, which happens incredibly often clinically, the excess risk compounds.
It is a devastating synergy. You're taking vessels that are already under high mechanical shear stress from the blood pressure, and you are adding the metabolic toxicity of chronic high blood sugar.
I was trying to visualize this earlier. If hypertension is like a river flowing way too fast and eroding its own banks, adding diabetes isn't just adding more water, it is like filling that rushing river with sharp, abrasive sand.
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy.
The high glucose actually alters the biochemistry of the blood, making the vessel walls even more inflamed and the blood more prone to clotting. You are mechanically blasting the wall while simultaneously degrading it chemically.
That is an exceptionally accurate way to visualize endothelial dysfunction. The high blood sugar impairs the vessel's ability to dilate and heal, while the hypertension provides the brute force to tear it apart.
It's a perfect storm.
It really is. And we also have to layer smoking into this risk profile. Smoking alone raises the risk 2 to 3-fold. And what is critical to understand here is the massive time investment required to undo that cellular damage.
Right, because you cannot just throw away your last pack of cigarettes and assume your vascular system resets to factory settings the next morning.
Not at all.
The epidemiological models show it takes more than 5 years of continuous cessation before a former smoker's risk curve finally bends down and approaches that of someone who has never smoked.
Because smoking doesn't just put plaque in your arteries, it fundamentally changes how sticky your blood is. It causes platelet aggregation.
Right, making it clot easier.
Exactly. It takes years for the body to clear that chronic inflammatory state and for the vessel walls to regenerate healthy, non-reactive lining.
It is a stubbornly entrenched risk factor. Now, let's get into one of the most fascinating nuances in the research, and honestly one I have to push back on a little bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
We see things like dyslipidemia and obesity on the modifiable list, which makes total sense. But the alcohol data forms what researchers call a J-shaped curve.
Yes, the famous J curve.
According to the data, light to moderate drinking actually shows a genuinely elegant protective effect against ischemic stroke by raising HDL, the good cholesterol, which helps clear out plaques.
Correct.
Meanwhile, heavy drinking sharply spikes the risk. So if I'm reading this right, does this mean a glass of wine with dinner is technically medicine?
I would caution you against grabbing the prescription pad just yet.
Fair enough.
It is a fascinating physiological mechanism, yes. Light ethanol intake does stimulate the liver to produce more HDL, which assists in reverse cholesterol transport, essentially acting like biological garbage trucks hauling cholesterol away from your arteries.
Right.
But that J-shaped curve is a highly volatile tightrope. The initial drop in risk is modest, but the upward spike on the other side of that J, when consumption crosses from moderate to heavy, is violently steep.
Because at heavy doses, alcohol becomes directly toxic to the heart muscle and actively drives up blood pressure, completely erasing any HDL benefits.
Precisely. The nuance here is crucial for anyone listening. Medical professionals warn heavily against interpreting population-level risk factor data as a personalized excuse to adopt or maintain a habit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially because, regardless of moderate alcohol intake, the sheer, crushing dominance of hypertension in the data will completely override any minoprotective benefits of a glass of wine if your blood pressure isn't tightly controlled.
Okay, fair enough. Put the wine glass down and check the blood pressure cuff.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. We've talked about the big, obvious lifestyle levers, diet, smoking, drinking, but now we need to dive under the surface.
Absolutely. Let's dig deeper.
We need to explore the hidden physiological rhythms and internal electrical issues that you listening might never have even considered as a stroke risk.
And the most significant of those hidden internal threats is atrial fibrillation, or AFib. This is the most common sustained cardiac arrhythmia in the world.
Basically an irregular heartbeat.
It is essentially a chaotic, irregular heartbeat,
Yeah.
and it is the undisputed leading cause of what we call cardioembolic stroke.
Let's break down exactly why that happens mechanically. In a healthy heart, the upper chambers, the atria, contract fully, squeezing the blood down into the ventricles.
Right.
But in AFib, those upper chambers are just fibrillating. They are essentially quivering like a bag of worms. Because they aren't squeezing fully, blood isn't moving cleanly. It pulls in the little crevices of the heart, and stagnant blood loves to clot.
That is the exact mechanical failure. When blood sits still in the left atrial appendage, the platelets bind together. A clot forms.
And then what?
While suddenly, that quivering heart manages a strong pump and it ejects that newly formed clot straight out of the heart, up the carotid artery, and directly into the brain.
Wow.
The risk here is staggering. Having AFib multiplies your stroke risk 5 to 6-fold.
And what's terrifying is how aggressively it scales with age. In people in their 50s, the prevalence of atrial fibrillation is well under 1%. But by the time people reach their 80s, nearly 9% of the population is walking around with this chaotic internal rhythm.
And beyond AFib, we also have to look at deeply under-the-radar systemic risks. Things like elevated fibrinogen and elevated homocysteine in the blood, which directly dictate how easily your blood clots.
Right.
Low physical activity. Obstructive sleep apnea, the research shows even just chronic heavy snoring is tied to worse stroke outcomes because it chronically starves the brain of oxygen at night and spikes blood pressure.
And this next one genuinely blew my mind, a recent infection. The clinical models show that being sick, fighting off a bacterial or viral infection within the week prior to a stroke is a highly recognized, albeit totally underappreciated risk factor.
It really is.
How does catching the flu suddenly put you at risk for a brain clot?
It is an incredible mechanism. When you get an infection, your immune system launches an acute phase response. Your liver starts pumping out massive amounts of inflammatory proteins, including fibrinogen, to help trap the invading pathogens.
Right.
But in doing so, your immune system accidentally makes your entire circulatory system hypercoagulable. It makes your blood incredibly sticky.
Wow.
You are walking around in a heightened state of systemic alert, meaning a plaque rupture that might have healed normally suddenly cascades into a massive, life-threatening clot.
Which brings us to perhaps the most incredible hidden rhythm of all the time of day, the pattern of the day. If you visualize a clock face and you mark every single stroke onset time from a hospital's database as a dot across an entire week, they do not scatter evenly.
No, they don't.
They are not random. They cluster heavily again and again in the early morning hours.
What's fascinating here is that this pattern holds true across almost all ischemic stroke subtypes, and it is driven entirely by our circadian rhythms.
Our internal body clocks.
Exactly. Right before we wake up, our bodies undergo massive, orchestrated physiological shifts to prepare us for consciousness. Our blood pressure naturally surges, our coagulability increases, and we get a massive flood of catecholamines, which are stress hormones like adrenaline.
It is like visualizing the human body as a complex mechanical clock. And right before we open our eyes in the morning, the internal gears experience this sudden, dangerous morning rush hour.
Yes.
You have high pressure blasting through the vessels right at the exact moment your blood is chemically primed to clot.
And that early morning storm of catecholamines and physiological changes is the exact same underlying mechanism that drives the well-documented early morning peak in heart attacks, too.
Yeah, wow, that makes perfect sense.
It reveals the intense underlying physiological cost of simply waking up and transitioning from sleep to wakefulness.
Yeah.
Your body is putting itself under massive mechanical stress just to get you out of bed.
It is wild to think about. But having established these deeply universal biological rhythms, the mechanics of how blood clots in the morning, how blood pressure wears down arteries, we have to look back at the global map.
They do.
Because we have to shatter the assumption that these biological patterns manifest the exact same way everywhere in the world, or that modern medicine is just marching on a straightforward path to victory.
The danger of assumption in epidemiology is profound. Regional risk patterns differ wildly, and if you try to apply a Western medical model uniformly across the globe, you will fail to treat the patients in front of you.
Right.
For example, Japan sees a significantly higher share of hemorrhagic strokes, where a fragile vessel actually bursts rather than gets blocked, compared to the US or Western Europe.
Why is that? I mean, is it genetic? or dietary?
It is a complex interplay. Historically, it has been linked to distinct environmental and dietary factors, such as exceptionally high sodium intake driving up blood pressure, combined with specific genetic predispositions regarding vessel wall integrity. Conversely, in India, the data shows a completely different anomaly, intracranial atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of the tiny, delicate arteries deep inside the brain. This is disproportionately common in much younger patients compared to the rest of the world.
It completely defies the Western textbook model. And when we look at the historical trends, what the data calls the vault, we uncover a deeply complex narrative about medical progress itself.
We do indeed.
For years, stroke mortality fell steeply across industrialized nations. It was heralded as a massive public health victory. But recently, that historic decline is actually reversing. Mortality rates are ticking back up.
Yes. And while an aging population naturally drives up the absolute numbers, there's another driver behind this reversal that is deeply counterintuitive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the other driver is better detection. We possess far more sensitive MRI machines today. We are now catching and recording tiny ischemic strokes that previously went completely unrecognized by medical science events that previous generations might have just chalked up to a dizzy spell or getting older.
Right.
But how does getting better at detecting a disease make our historical progress look worse on paper?
It is the ultimate paradox of epidemiological progress. Progress isn't a straight line. Sometimes developing better medical technology and sharper diagnostic criteria doesn't immediately result in better-looking data.
It just reveals more cases.
Exactly. It simply illuminates the true, daunting scale of the problem we've been fighting in the dark for decades. We aren't necessarily failing at treating the disease. We are just finally turning on the lights and seeing exactly how massive the monster truly is.
Which brings us full circle, right back to the beginning of our deep dive today. That 68-year-old man, found by his daughter on the kitchen floor, unable to move his arm, his words completely scrambled. Based on the massive demographic and physiological puzzle we've just put together, we now see exactly how he fits into this population-level picture.
Perfectly.
At 68, he is in the absolute prime age bracket for men to suffer stroke. We now know he has a 40-year smoking history, meaning his endothelial lining is severely damaged, and even if he survives this and quits today, he is at least 5 years away from his blood chemistry, returning to a non-smoker's baseline.
Yes.
And most crucially, he has long-standing, poorly controlled hypertension, the abrasive sand in the eroding river.
And while the ambulance dispatcher doesn't know his exact stroke mechanism yet, we don't know if it was a rogue clot from undiagnosed AFib or ruptured atherosclerotic plaque. We perfectly understand the population he represents.
Right.
His risk factors were compounding for decades, silently aligning with global statistical averages, until the exact biological moment his vessel finally occluded.
It is a profound realization of how massive global datasets map directly onto real, fragile human lives. And for you listening, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Yeah.
We spend time talking about that dangerous physiological morning rush hour, the massive spike in blood pressure, catecholamines, and clotting factors that happens right before we wake up.
Such a crucial window.
If our bodies are fundamentally operating on that precise internal circadian clock, perhaps the future of stroke prevention isn't just about what new medications we can invent in a lab. Perhaps the real breakthrough will be discovering the exact time of night we should be taking our existing medications, perfectly timing the dosage to intercept and neutralize that early morning storm before it ever even begins.